and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share 4 Wendigo stories I came across on the internet. These stories include a girl locking eyes with a horrific creature outside her home, and 2 stories that involve mimicking the voice of someone close to the poster. The sinister mimicking these creatures employ to try and lure people into the woods and out of their homes is truly unsettling. I couldn't imagine how terrifying it must be to hear a familiar voice only to realize it couldn't possibly be that person because they are nowhere close to your current location. Alright, let's get to the first story. Our first story comes from a poster who lives in Turner, Maine. Turner is located in Androscoggin County in the southwest part of the state and has a population of just under 6,000 residents according to the 2020 census. On June 20th, 1768, the township was granted to Major James Warren and other survivors who fought in the Battle of Quebec in 1690 as members of Captain Joseph Sylvester's company. It was primarily a farming town known for producing corn and apples. The original poster, or OP, has had numerous encounters while taking late-night walks in the area over the last few years. It gets to the point where sometimes she is so overcome by a raw primal fear and the overwhelming sense that something is watching her from the woods during her walks. When these feelings come over her, she has the intense urge to get somewhere safe and to get there fast. There was one time in particular she points out where something followed her from the tree line and was acting very aggressive. This thing, whatever it was, would whisper in low tones as it walked or ran beside her, walking when she walked and running when she did. By the sound of the footsteps, this thing was bipedal and she describes them as sounding human-like while crunching the brush on the ground. Except they were extremely heavy. Way too heavy to be a human. The creature was huge by the sound of its footfalls. It also leapt through the top of the trees, occasionally knocking one over as it did so. This to me, other than the leaping through the trees, sounds just like Sasquatch behavior. Or possibly a dogman. I've heard of both chasing people out of the forest while remaining just inside the tree line, but the knocking over of the trees makes me think Sasquatch. The OP has had many encounters just like this one, some just as terrifying while others weren't as bad. The only time she actually visibly saw something was when she had her encounter with a Wendigo. She is unsure of the creature's intentions for her. She speculates that maybe it wanted to eat her, possess her, or simply show itself to her to invoke fear. She was standing beside her home's front steps, having just lit her cigarette, when instinct kicked in and she felt this thing coming through the woods outside her home. She froze, waiting for it to emerge from the trees, not knowing if it was her own curiosity that held her in place or if the Wendigo somehow held her there. When it did emerge from the trees, she was horrified. This thing was grotesque and sickening. She sensed pure evil emanating from this creature. It was massive, easily 10 feet tall but standing on all fours. Its head was huge, with sunken eye sockets that housed bright glowing golden orbs. Its frame was sickly thin, with a skeletal chest and looked to have been starved to near death by the look of its caved-in stomach. This thing's arms and legs were extremely long and disproportionate to the rest of its body. The limbs were the only thing about this creature that had any kind of mass whatsoever. It had patches of fur sporadically growing on its arms, back, and thighs. The Wendigo looked to be smiling at her, revealing long, razor-sharp, fang-like teeth. Its mouth covered a large portion of its face, which only had nostrils where its nose should have been. Its face looked more like a skull than an actual face. She locked eyes with this thing and saw a brief flash of herself from the monster's point of view. This shook her to her core. She tore her gaze from this evil being and ran inside, not thinking twice about the lit cigarette still in her mouth. She locked the door behind her, hurried up to her room, closed the blinds, and sat shaking for hours. She refused to leave her room and did not sleep at all. She goes on to detail that Androscoggin County is known for these types of creatures and other supernatural and paranormal events as well, most notably hauntings and even a portal seen in the area. But the only things she knows for sure that have happened in the area are things she has experienced during her nightly walks. She has heard screams she describes as terrifying and otherworldly, like that of a banshee. She turned to the internet where she posted her story in hopes of finding someone who could relate, and she did just that, as several commenters claimed to have seen something that looks exactly like what she describes. One commenter said their encounter took place 2 hours from Turner, and the other doesn't say where they live, just that they saw something just like what she described put its face against their sister's window one night. I couldn't even begin to imagine having an encounter like either of the two our OP described, with the one cryptid chasing her in the woods and the Wendigo showing up at her house. But I know one thing for certain: I would stop taking walks late at night, or even at night in general. That seems to be when the activity is heightened, and it certainly doesn't seem safe. Hopefully this thing, or nothing else for that matter, shows up at her house again. Our next story takes place near the Great Lakes. The original poster doesn't give an exact location, and there are 8 states that border the Great Lakes and the Canadian province of Ontario, so I'll let you try to figure that one out if you feel up to the task. The OP's post begins with her and her boyfriend going on a walk down a trail during winter. They were the only ones there and had decided to take the longest trail that went the deepest into the forest. That way they would have their privacy should anyone else show up. The tracks they saw on the trails looked to be old, which let them know that no one had walked that trail in quite a while. They have both had what she describes as spiritual encounters in that area, but had not encountered anything bad. That is, until their walk on this day. It started with the breaking of branches and a weird chittering sound she heard, but her boyfriend didn't. She brushed it off as being just a squirrel, and they continued on for about 10 more minutes before she needed to stop and take a break due to her asthma. When they stopped, they found themselves in the middle of the woods, isolated. That's when a foul stench hit them. She describes it as smelling like rotting meat. It was accompanied by the return of the clicking sound. This time, her boyfriend heard the clicking too. A feeling of dread washed over her, and she decided it was time to go. As they started heading back, the clicking sound continued, and by the sound of it, it seemed like it was close by. But they also heard what sounded like a child screaming deeper in the woods. They took off running when they heard this, but had to stop shortly thereafter due to her asthma. The scream continued to echo through the woods in the distance, so the OP decided to push through, and they kept walking even though her sides and chest hurt. Finally, they made it to the car and were able to leave without further incident. This is another story that I decided to include with other Wendigo stories because the OP was wondering if that's what she and her boyfriend encountered that day. So it's tough to say exactly what kind of creature they experienced, but the actions by whatever was out there could be attributed to a Wendigo. Like many of these stories, we'll never know for sure. What do you think? Wendigo or something else? Our next to last story from this episode comes from South Central Wisconsin, where a woman and her family were renting a home from her aunt. Their home is in a rural part of the state where the houses are more than a block apart from one another. The original poster says that her niece and her children had just gotten home from their choir concert, and she was putting her youngest in the high chair when she heard her dog whining at the door wanting to come inside. This was followed by her husband's voice teasing the dog. Except her husband was working 2 hours away. Her first thought was that her husband had gotten off early and had come home to surprise them. Even her oldest son, who was 9 years old at the time, heard his voice too. He even said, "Oh, Daddo is home," as she was on her way to the kitchen window to look outside. But when she did look, she didn't see her husband's truck in the driveway. She thought this was weird and walked to the back door where the dog was now in a near state of panic, whimpering and crying, scratching heavily at the door trying to get inside. This was very odd behavior for the dog because she is very friendly and loves people, always greeting them energetically. But on this night, she was desperate to come inside. So the OP's niece let her in and had the overwhelming feeling to lock the door, so she did. She then turned to her oldest son and asked why he thought his dad was home. The boy answered by telling his mom he heard his father talking to the dog outside. Her next thought was that she pocket dialed her husband and heard his voice through the phone. She checked and this was not the case. In fact, she later found out that during this incident, he was at work. Later that night, the dog was still refusing to go outside. She eventually did, but was pacing back and forth while their cat was loudly crying. The OP's niece started praying for positive energy and protection, and both pets settled down, with the dog finally going out into the yard to use the bathroom. It's said that the Wendigo are more active during the winter months, and the area right around the time of this event had just gotten ice and snowstorms, with several inches falling the night before this incident. Her niece's first thought was a skinwalker, but they don't live near any Native American lands. Plus, it mimicked the voice of a loved one, which is indicative of a Wendigo, where skinwalker usually only mimics animal sounds. This one to me points more toward this being a Wendigo, especially with the mimicking of the father's voice. Plus, it appeared during winter months right after a snowstorm. Supposedly, these conditions bring about more Wendigo sightings. Some argue that Wendigo are only where it's cold, but I'm not ready to throw my hat into that ring. We know next to nothing about these beings, so there isn't any way to know if that's true or not. What do you think? The final story of this episode comes to us from northern Minnesota. The original poster does not give an exact location, but does say her encounter took place in a state forest near a Native American reservation. No stranger to the paranormal, our OP, who was 33 at the time of these events, has had experiences since she was 4 years old. However, this particular encounter is one of the most terrifying she has ever gone through. She traveled to northern Minnesota in early October to visit two very good friends of hers she refers to as M and C, who live in a state forest and not all that far from a reservation. She would be sleeping in a camper in their backyard with her miniature Dachshund during their stay. By the way she describes the events, it sounds like her encounter took place on the very first night of her stay. She had walked down to the camper with her dog at around midnight and discovered that there were some things she needed to set up in order to make her stay more comfortable, the main thing being the heater. She finished around 1:30 in the morning and realized she hadn't locked the door. She figured this wasn't a big deal, being that she was in the middle of the woods. What could she possibly have to worry about out there? Well, she would soon find out. She was laying in bed, unable to fall asleep, with her anxiety running amok. Her friend's dogs, two basset hounds, were barking and their geese were honking nonstop. Her Dachshund, who usually slept under the covers with her, was sitting on her hip, alert, looking back and forth. It was almost like she was tracking the movement of something outside the trailer. The OP tried to stow her under the blankets so she'd go to sleep, but she kept returning to her hip, where she continued to look back and forth. She then heard her friend M's voice call out from just outside the camper. "Anybody in there?" Then she heard what sounded like claws being dragged down the side of the camper. Her initial reaction was to answer her friend, but she then realized that M and C had gone to bed and had to have been asleep by that point. M also knew she was in the camper, so why would she call out asking if anyone was in there? That's when she noticed that everything outside the camper had gone eerily quiet. The dogs had stopped barking. The geese had stopped honking. The wind had even stopped blowing. The forest stood completely still. She realized then that her dog would be barking if whatever was outside the camper was human. Instead, she sat on her hip, shaking. She wasn't about to move, not with whatever was outside lurking around the camper. Except the door was unlocked. She lay there for what felt like an eternity, but was really about 10 to 15 minutes, trying to decide if she should dare get up to go lock the door. Her first thought was that this thing was a skinwalker, but she knew they didn't mimic the voices of those close to you to try to lure you into the woods. She had heard that making eye contact with one would give them the power to lure you out of your home. Luckily, she had closed all the curtains and every fiber of her being was telling her not to look outside. So she slipped out of bed and slowly made her way to the front door, avoiding the urge to peek through even the slightest opening in the curtains. Walking as softly as she could, she reached the camper's door and turned the lock as slowly as she could while praying and holding her breath. She once again resisted even glancing at any of the windows as she slowly made her way back to the bed and crawled under the covers, pulling her dog under there with her. The dog stayed there this time. As soon as she laid back down, the wind started blowing again and she heard the 2 basset hounds come running toward the camper howling. The geese once again started honking. After the hounds ran past the camper and a little ways into the woods, they returned to the camper before barking a few times and settling down right outside. The next morning, the OP told her friends what happened, hoping her friend would say that she had come to check on her during the night. But she didn't. She had gone to bed as soon as she left the house to make her way to the camper. The following night, the OP said a prayer over the house, the camper, and everyone, and nothing happened that night. After visiting her friends, she went to see her father, who lived about 3 hours away. When she took her dog out at night at her father's, she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. She chalked it up to paranoia about what happened at her friend's house that night and made sure to watch the dog for any suspicious behavior, but she acted normal. She shared her story in hopes that she could gather more information about the creature she encountered and get some advice on how to ward off any unwelcome visitors in the night, since she plans to move back to the area where she had encountered the Wendigo. Her main concern was that it would find her again when she moved back to the area. She updated her post saying she will seek the help of elders at the nearest reservation in hopes of never encountering this creature again. In my last video, I discussed the idea of crawlers potentially catching our scent and being able to hunt us. And I've heard of the hitchhiker effect with both Sasquatch and dogmen. It's also said that skinwalkers and Wendigo can attach themselves to you and follow you, but that's only if you interact with them. From the stories that I've read and what I've heard, it's said that the best thing you can do is ignore them when they try to interact with you, that they will eventually leave you alone when they see that you want nothing to do with them. If I were her, I would definitely pray over the new house and property when I moved back to the area. It worked while she was staying with her friends. What do you think? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.